QatarEnergy, the company that operates the largest liquefied natural gas plant on planet Earth, confirmed last month that parts of that plant sustained missile damage during the war and that the damage will take up to 5 years to repair. 5 years. That is not a typo. The world's largest LNG facility, which supplies approximately 20% of all liquefied natural gas that moves across oceans to power homes, industry, and electricity grids across Asia and Europe, has been structurally damaged in a way that cannot be fixed before the summer of 2031. And yet, most Americans watching the news last week heard that the ceasefire was announced and breathed out as if the crisis was behind them. It is not behind them. It is in front of them. And the thing they do not realize is that the Strait of Hormuz staying closed for another 3 months, another 6 months, or another year does not produce a linear worsening of the economic pain. It produces a geometric one. It triggers cascading force majeure declarations. It pushes oil toward $200 a barrel according to projections that U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts are already modeling. It strips global supply of 23% of world ammonia demand, 33% of world helium production, 20% of seaborne jet fuel, 10% of seaborne diesel, and roughly a fifth of all crude oil traded at sea. It forces countries to ration fuel. It drives insurance premiums to the point where commercial transit becomes economically impossible. It permanently repositions trade routes and trading partners. And it does all of this while the American public, trained by 6 weeks of escalating headlines followed by one ceasefire announcement, believes the worst is over. The worst is not over. The worst has not started. Because what comes next, if the strait stays closed, is an economic scenario that most Americans under the age of 60 have never experienced and have no mental framework to prepare for. And I am going to walk you through it. Not as speculation, as the documented projections of the Dallas Federal Reserve, the International Energy Agency, the Atlantic Council, TotalEnergies chief executive, and every major commodity research firm on Earth. Because people do not realize what happens after the strait stays closed, and they need to. Because the consequences start small, almost invisible, and then compound week by week until the prices on your grocery receipt tell a story the news anchors never told you. This is that story. The Dallas Fed model shows oil at $132. By year-end, if the closure lasts 3 quarters and global GDP falls 1.3 points. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published an economic model in March 2026 that examined the precise consequences of different durations of Strait of Hormuz closure. The findings, buried in a research paper that almost no mainstream media outlet has translated into plain English, are devastating. If the closure lasts 1 quarter, global real GDP growth in 2026 falls 0.2 percentage points, which sounds small but represents approximately $300 billion in lost global output, concentrated in energy-importing economies, including the United States. If the closure lasts 2 quarters, global GDP falls 0.3 percentage points. If the closure lasts 3 quarters, global GDP falls 1.3 percentage points, which is not a small number. That is the difference between a global economy that is growing and a global economy that has fallen into synchronized contraction across every major region. And the Dallas Fed model also projects that the oil price, which initially spiked to $120 during the fighting and settled to approximately $95 after the collapsed ceasefire, would climb to as high as $132 per barrel by year-end 2026 if shipping resumes after 3 quarters of closure. That means oil is lower now than it will be in December, even if the strait reopens. Think about what that sentence implies. The market has not yet fully priced the duration of the closure. Traders are still betting that the ceasefire will eventually hold, that diplomacy will eventually succeed, that the disruption will be limited. If those bets turn out to be wrong, oil does not stabilize at current levels. It climbs from here. And the Dallas Fed is not an alarmist organization. It is a regional Federal Reserve bank staffed by economists whose professional reputation depends on producing conservative, defensible, peer-reviewed forecasts. When the Dallas Fed publishes a scenario in which the oil supply shortfall reaches close to 20% of global supply, 3 to 5 times larger than the Yom Kippur War shock of 1973, the Iranian Revolution shock of 1979, or the Iraq-Iran War shock of 1980, the economic implications are genuinely unprecedented. Because this is the first time the Strait of Hormuz has actually been closed. Not threatened. Not almost closed. Actually closed. 230 loaded tankers sitting inside the Gulf with nowhere to go. 90% of normal shipments prevented for weeks, going on months. And the Dallas Fed calculated these numbers before the Islamabad talks collapsed on April 12th and before Trump declared the naval blockade on April 13th. The model's base case assumed a resolution. The resolution has not occurred, which means the Dallas Fed's $132 oil projection is, at this point, the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario, the one that Wall Street analysts and U.S. government officials are now openly discussing, is $200 per barrel. Qatar's LNG plant damaged for 5 years means Europe's energy crisis is permanent and American heating bills will follow. Roughly 20% of all liquefied natural gas traded globally is exported from Qatar, and essentially all of it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When QatarEnergy declared force majeure on its gas contracts on March 4th and stopped LNG production on March 2nd after missile strikes damaged the Ras Laffan Industrial City and Mesaieed Industrial City facilities, the consequences began radiating outward through global gas markets at a velocity that surprised even energy economists who have studied LNG markets for decades. Europe receives 12 to 14% of its total LNG from Qatar through the strait. European natural gas prices jumped more than 70% in the weeks following the strikes. Daily freight rates for LNG tankers jumped more than 40% on a single Monday after Qatar halted operations. Unlike the oil market, the global LNG market has no equivalent of strategic petroleum reserves. There is no coordinated international mechanism that can release LNG from storage to stabilize supply. Each country's LNG inventory is what it is, and when that inventory runs down, there is no emergency backstop. Shell issued a warning that Europe could face a fuel shortage as early as this month. German, British, and Italian industrial consumers who use natural gas to power chemical plants, steel mills, aluminum smelters, and ceramics factories have begun cutting production because the gas is either too expensive to use or physically unavailable. Chemical and steel manufacturers across the EU and UK have imposed surcharges of up to 30% to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. The European Central Bank warned that a prolonged conflict would likely trigger stagflation and push major energy-dependent economies, including Germany and Italy, into technical recession by end of 2026. Germany's yearly growth forecast was cut to just 0.6%. Oxford University's economics department modeled that the UK and the Eurozone as a whole are at risk of contraction. And this is the part most Americans do not realize. When European industrial production becomes 30% more expensive or physically impossible because of LNG disruption, American consumers pay the price. Every European car, every German pharmaceutical, every Italian machine tool, every British consumer good that is imported into the United States carries those European energy cost increases embedded in the final price. And Europe, desperate for gas, has been competing with Asian buyers for the remaining available LNG cargoes from the United States, which is the world's largest LNG exporter. American LNG export terminals are already operating near capacity. The only way to supply more LNG to Europe is to divert cargoes from Asia or to raise prices until demand destruction reduces the shortage. Both outcomes increase the price that Americans pay for natural gas at home. Heating bills for the winter of 2026 to 2027 are being repriced right now based on the assumption that the Qatar facility will not be back online before 2031. Electricity bills in states with significant natural gas generation, which means most states, will climb through the summer as utilities hedge against continued supply uncertainty. And industrial customers from Texas to Pennsylvania to Ohio will see their input costs rise in ways that get passed to every product they sell, every wage they pay, and every investment they choose not to make because the cost of operating just climbed. Force majeure is spreading across the Gulf, and the Qatari Energy Minister said it will bring down the economies of the world. Qatari Energy Minister Saad Sherida Al-Kaabi made a statement on March 6 that should have been the lead story on every financial network in the world and was instead buried on page 12. He warned that if the war continues, other Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports and declare force majeure, and that this will bring down economies of the world. That is a sitting cabinet minister of one of the world's most important energy-producing nations saying publicly that the continuation of the current crisis will cause a global economic collapse. Not inconvenience, not slowdown, collapse. And in the days and weeks following his warning, the force majeure cascade he predicted began. The Kuwait Petroleum Corporation declared force majeure and announced production cuts on March 7th. Bahrain's Bapco Energies declared force majeure. The United Arab Emirates lowered its oil production. By March 8th, production at the three main oil fields in southern Iraq had dropped 70% since the start of the war, from 4.3 million barrels per day to just 1.3 million. By March 12th, Gulf Arab states had collectively cut production by at least 10 million barrels per day. On March 13th, Saudi Arabia reduced its oil production by 20% from 10 million barrels per day to 8 million after the shutdown of two of Saudi Aramco's offshore production facilities. Every one of these force majeure declarations and production cuts is a legal contract cancellation. When a producer declares force majeure, they are invoking a clause in their supply contracts that releases them from delivery obligations due to circumstances beyond their control. The buyers on the other side of those contracts, refineries across Asia and Europe, utilities that burn natural gas for electricity, chemical manufacturers who use Gulf-sourced feedstocks, and fertilizer producers who depend on Middle Eastern ammonia suddenly find themselves without the supplies they contracted for and without any legal recourse. They have to buy on the spot market, which means competing with every other buyer in the world for whatever supplies remain available outside of the Gulf. The result is bidding wars that drive prices not just higher, but to levels that permanently change which industries can afford to operate. When fertilizer becomes unaffordable, farmers plant less. When natural gas becomes unaffordable, aluminum smelters close. When jet fuel becomes unaffordable, airlines cut routes. When diesel becomes unaffordable, trucking companies raise rates, and every product delivered by truck becomes more expensive. And the force majeure cascade does not unwind when the ceasefire is announced. Contracts that have been broken are not automatically restored. Relationships between buyers and sellers that have been disrupted take months or years to rebuild. The trust that underpins international commodity markets, which was built up over decades, can be destroyed in weeks. And rebuilding it is not a matter of resuming shipments. It is a matter of renegotiating every contract, reassessing every supplier, and diversifying every supply chain to reduce exposure to the same kind of shock happening again. The Strait moves far more than oil and LNG and the commodities nobody is talking about will show up in your groceries and your hospital. The Atlantic Council published an analysis on April 13th that deserves to be studied by every American who thinks the Hormuz crisis is just about gasoline. Before the Iran war, the Gulf region supplied roughly 20% of global seaborne jet fuel, 10% of global seaborne diesel, 23% of global ammonia demand, and 33% of global helium production. Let me explain why each of those numbers matters in ways that will affect your daily life in the next 12 months. Ammonia is the foundation of synthetic fertilizer, which is what grows approximately half of the world's food. When 23% of global ammonia demand becomes harder to meet, fertilizer prices rise, which means the price of corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, and every food crop that depends on nitrogen fertilizer rises. Your grocery bill does not show you an ammonia line item, but the price of every protein, every grain, every vegetable, every processed food, every restaurant meal, and every fast food item is connected to ammonia through the fertilizer that grew the ingredients. Helium is used in medical MRI machines, semiconductor manufacturing, welding, scientific research, and high-performance computing. When 33% of global helium production comes from the region that is now effectively blockaded, MRI scans become more expensive. Semiconductor production becomes more constrained, which tightens the supply of every chip-dependent product, including cars, phones, computers, and appliances. Jet fuel at 20% of global seaborne supply means airlines are already cutting routes and raising ticket prices. Domestic and international airfares will climb 20 to 40% by the end of 2026 if the disruption persists. Business travel becomes more expensive, which reduces economic activity. Leisure travel becomes more expensive, which reduces consumer spending in tourism-dependent regions including Florida, Las Vegas, and Hawaii. Diesel at 10% of global seaborne supply matters because diesel is the fuel that runs American trucking, American agriculture, American rail, and American construction. When 10% of global diesel supply becomes unavailable or much more expensive, every ton of freight moved in America becomes more expensive. Every acre of land farmed becomes more expensive. Every building constructed becomes more expensive, and every consumer product distributed through those systems becomes more expensive. The Atlantic Council explicitly noted that the most vulnerable populations will simply go without, not as a policy choice, but as an outcome of limited supply. That sentence describes not a developing country in Africa or South Asia. That sentence describes the bottom quartile of the American income distribution. The 40 million Americans who depend on SNAP. The 8 million seniors on fixed incomes whose food assistance is being cut. The rural families who drive 60 miles each way to work and cannot absorb $5 per gallon gasoline. The elderly households that heat with natural gas or heating oil in the Northeast and Midwest. They are the first and largest victims of a commodity scramble they never caused and cannot influence. And there are additional commodities flowing through the Gulf that most Americans have never even heard named as inputs to their daily lives. Sulfur is exported in large quantities from the Gulf region and is used in phosphate fertilizer production and industrial chemicals. Aluminum smelting is energy-intensive and concentrated in the UAE and Bahrain, using cheap Gulf natural gas as an input. When the natural gas becomes unavailable or too expensive, aluminum production contracts, pushing up the price of everything that uses aluminum, from soda cans to automobile parts to construction materials to medical devices. LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which fuels propane grills, forklift fleets, rural heating systems, and petrochemical plants, is also significantly sourced from Gulf producers. And petrochemicals themselves, the feedstock for plastics, are produced from Gulf hydrocarbons. When Gulf petrochemical exports contract, the price of plastics rises, and plastics are used in packaging, medical devices, automotive parts, consumer electronics, and virtually every piece of modern manufactured goods. The Atlantic Council's list of affected commodities ran from ammonia to aluminum, and every single item on that list connects back to consumer prices through some combination of direct consumption and embedded input costs. Americans who have no idea that Qatar produces a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, or that the UAE is one of the top global aluminum smelters, or that Gulf refineries supply a significant share of global jet fuel, are about to learn these facts through the mechanism of rising prices on goods they buy every week. And by the time they learn them, the price repricing will have already happened. The knowledge will arrive at the checkout line, not at the news anchor's desk. The insurance market alone has already effectively closed the strait, and it will stay closed even after a political resolution. War risk ship insurance premiums for Strait of Hormuz transit were 0.125% of ship insurance value per transit before the war. In the days before the February 28 strikes, they jumped to between 0.2 and 0.4%. After the strikes, war risk underwriters moved with what commodity analysts described as unusual speed. They submitted policy cancellation notices on the weekend of February 28th before markets reopened on Monday, March 2nd. That speed reflected the pace of escalation and the degree of concern among underwriters. And once insurance is withdrawn, the strait is effectively closed for commercial shipping, even if no ship is physically attacked. Kepler analysts wrote that insurance withdrawal is doing the work that physical blockade has not. The outcome for cargo flow is largely the same. Maersk paused all vessel crossings in the strait until further notice. CMA CGM and Hapag-Lloyd, the other two major global container shipping companies, followed. Insurance costs for very large oil tankers rose by approximately $250,000 per transit. And the Joint War Committee of the London insurance market, which sets the standards that most global marine insurers follow, added the waters around Oman to its list of high-risk maritime areas. That expansion of the risk zone is not reversed by a ceasefire announcement. Insurance markets reprice risk based on demonstrated events. Before February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz closure was considered a tail risk. After February 28th, it is a demonstrated reality. And the premium that underwriters charge for that risk has been permanently repriced upward. Even if the political crisis fully resolves tomorrow, insurance premiums for Hormuz transit will remain elevated for years, possibly a decade, because the underwriters who were caught offside in March 2026 will not allow themselves to be caught offside again. Higher insurance premiums mean higher shipping costs. Higher shipping costs mean higher delivered prices for every commodity that moves through the strait. And the shipping companies that built their business models around the assumption of stable, low-cost Hormuz transit will have to restructure, raise rates, or exit the market entirely. Some will do the latter, which reduces shipping capacity, which raises rates further, which further increases the cost of commodities delivered from the Gulf. It is a self-reinforcing loop, and it is already underway. And there is a subtler consequence of the insurance repricing that most analysts have not publicly emphasized. Global marine insurance is dominated by a relatively small group of London-based underwriters, reinsurers in Zurich and Munich, and specialty carriers in New York and Singapore. When the Joint War Committee designates waters as high risk, the effect ripples across the entire reinsurance chain. Primary insurers pay more to reinsurers. Reinsurers pay more to retrocessionaires. The capital that supports the global marine insurance market has a finite capacity, and when a major choke point is reclassified as high risk, that capacity is consumed by the Gulf region at the expense of every other shipping route on Earth, which means insurance premiums for shipping between Asia and Europe through the Suez Canal are rising because Gulf premiums are consuming industry capital. Insurance premiums for shipping around the Cape of Good Hope, the alternative route that avoids the Middle East entirely, are rising. Insurance premiums for Pacific shipping lanes are rising. The Hormuz closure is not just repricing the Gulf, it is repricing global maritime risk. And every shipping company from Maersk to Mediterranean Shipping Company to Evergreen is adjusting rates upward on routes that have nothing directly to do with the Middle East because the cost of being in the marine shipping business has climbed globally. Those rate adjustments flow into the landed cost of every container arriving at every American port, which flows into the shelf price of every imported good, which flows into the budget of every American household. America's oil independence is a myth in a Hormuz closure because prices are set globally and we still import what we cannot refine. American politicians have spent the past decade telling the public that the United States is energy independent and therefore insulated from Middle East supply disruptions. That claim is technically true in one narrow sense and profoundly misleading in every other sense. It is true that the United States produces more crude oil than it consumes on a net basis. It is also true that the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer and the world's largest LNG exporter. What is not true is that any of this insulates American consumers from the price consequences of a Strait of Hormuz closure. Oil is a globally traded commodity. The price of a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude produced in the Permian Basin is set by the global market. When the global market experiences a 10 to 20% supply shortfall, every barrel of oil traded anywhere in the world reprices upward, including the barrel produced in Texas. American oil companies are not obligated to sell their production at prices lower than the global market. They are publicly traded companies with shareholders. They sell to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder during a Hormuz closure is whoever is most desperate for supply, which in April 2026 is every Asian refinery scrambling to replace Middle Eastern barrels. Several industry participants told Bloomberg they were seeing signs that U.S. oil exports to Asia are poised to surge as refineries there hunt for alternative suppliers. A senior Latin American oil trader described receiving calls from buyers they had been unsuccessfully courting for years who are now desperate to purchase and willing to seal deals with little or no negotiation. American-produced oil is being rerouted to Asian buyers willing to pay the premium, which reduces the supply available to American refineries, which increases the price American refineries pay for the oil they need, which increases the price of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and heating oil at every American pump, terminal, and retailer. And the second layer of the myth is that American refineries are configured for crude grades that domestic production does not provide. Gulf Coast refineries, the largest refining complex on Earth, were built to process heavy, sour crude from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Canada. Domestic shale oil is light, sweet crude. The refinery configurations do not flip overnight. Even during years when the United States was technically a net exporter, the country was importing 2.4 billion barrels of oil per year to keep the refineries that produce American gasoline supplied with the crude grades they need. When Saudi Arabia is producing 20% less oil because its export routes through Hormuz are blocked, and when Venezuelan production is constrained by sanctions, and when Mexican production is declining, the heavy sour crude that American refineries need becomes scarce at exactly the moment that every other refinery in the world is competing for the same grades. The price difference between light sweet and heavy sour crude, which is called the crude differential, has already widened. Refinery margins on U.S. gasoline are rising because the input costs have climbed faster than the Fed or the public has yet absorbed. And the American consumer, who has been told their country is energy independent, is discovering that being the world's largest producer does not protect you from global price shocks when you are also the world's largest consumer and when your refineries depend on imports that the global supply crisis has put at risk. The final thing people need to understand about a sustained Strait of Hormuz closure is that the consequences are not reversible just because the strait eventually reopens. Patrick Pouyanne, the CEO of TotalEnergies, said at the CERAWeek conference in Houston that if the crisis lasts more than 3 or 4 months, it becomes a systemic problem for the world. The Atlantic Council's April 13th analysis warned that a prolonged closure, during which alternative supply chains improve, coupled with a fragile ceasefire where attacks may resume, could make companies wary of returning to the strait even after reopening. Industry participants are already seeing LNG suppliers becoming more selective in negotiating mid to long-term volumes because selling into the spot market is more lucrative during the disruption. The infrastructure that has been damaged during the fighting, including refineries in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, LNG facilities, pipelines, and port terminals, will take months or years to rebuild. The capital that was flowing into Gulf energy infrastructure will now flow to other regions with less geopolitical risk. And the buyers who had been loyal customers of Gulf producers for decades are currently building relationships with alternative suppliers in Latin America, West Africa, and North America. Those new relationships, once established, do not automatically reverse when the Gulf producers come back online. Global commodity markets are being reshaped in real time. Trade routes that have been stable for 50 years are being rerouted. Insurance regimes that have been predictable for a generation are being revised. Strategic reserves that took decades to accumulate are being depleted in weeks. And the American consumer, who has been told repeatedly that the ceasefire means the crisis is over, is about to discover that the prices they pay at the pump, at the grocery store, at the hardware store, on their electric bill, and on their heating bill in the coming winter are the cumulative result of every one of those structural shifts compounding on top of the direct energy price shock. The strait is not just a waterway. It is the plumbing of the modern global economy. And when the plumbing breaks, you do not notice immediately. You notice when the pressure drops at the tap, when the water runs brown, when the bills arrive, when the outages start. The strait broke on February 28th. The ceasefire did not fix it. And the pressure is going to keep dropping for the next 12 to 24 months, whether or not diplomacy eventually succeeds. Share this video with every American you know who buys groceries, pays an electric bill, drives a car, heats a home, flies on an airplane, takes medication that requires semiconductor manufacturing, or eats food grown with fertilizer. Because every one of them is about to discover what happens after the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, and they deserve to hear it from someone willing to tell them the truth. Subscribe and turn on notifications because I will be tracking every shipment, every insurance premium, every commodity price, and every piece of economic data that connects the geopolitical reality to the American kitchen table in real time. No spin, no party line. Just the numbers, the timelines, and what they mean for your money. Take care of yourselves out there. Clarity is the last public good nobody is paid to provide, and I will see you in the next one. And remember, the strait does not need to stay closed forever for the consequences to be permanent. 3 months is enough. 6 months is catastrophic. A year reshapes the entire global economy in ways your grandchildren will still be paying for when the current crisis is a footnote in history books.